Hi, everyone. I'm Pastor Chuck, and welcome to Theology in 10. Thanks for joining me here today on Theology in 10, the 10-minute Bible session in which I answer your questions about the Bible, theology, Christianity, and church history, all things theological. Well, at least within the circles of Christianity and its history. I am an ordained minister in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, and I'm really glad to have you join me here today once again. Today we have an interesting question, and I'm just going to pull it up here. This question is about something known as the new perspective on Paul. Now, before I read the question, I just want to say that this at first might seem like it has a very academic twist that might not seem very relevant to you and your daily life, but bear with me. I believe it is relevant for different reasons, and I hope I can get to that here. So bear with me. Some of the language will sound like, what is he talking about? I hope I can explain that. And thanks to the questioner for writing this. Of course, I never give their name. These questions are anonymous. You can give me your name, of course, but I will never read who wrote these questions, just as a standard rule for no reason, just for so people can feel safe to ask anything they want. Now, this question's a bit long. I'm going to shorten it just a little bit. But the questioner asks this. There was a theological trend 10 years ago or so called the New Perspective on Paul. Any chance that we can get an update on the progress of that, especially from a Lutheran perspective? Okay, so there's more to the question, but I'm just going to leave it there because we need to talk about what is the new perspective on Paul? What is this questioner asking about? And you might ask, well, there's a new perspective on Paul. Was there an old perspective? And so the answer to that is yes, indeed. There really was an old perspective, which we'll define a little bit more as we go on again. The old perspective on Paul, as it is sometimes known, is basically the view and understanding of Paul. Who are we talking about? Paul? We're talking about Paul the Apostle, the Paul the Apostle that wrote many of the letters in the New Testament, the Pauline letters or the Pauline epistles. So the significant portion of the New Testament consists of his writing. So that's the Paul we're talking about. And so the old perspective on Paul, as it were, is what we know as basically the Lutheran perspective, or the perspective of the early reformers in the 16th century. Now, beginning with Luther and scholars after him and theologians after him, part of the Protestant Reformation, they began to read Paul through the lens of their own culture, their own religious views, their own times, the problems that they saw in their own churches. And so they would read Paul as if he were writing to the church in the 16th century and trying to address the late medieval church's problems. And so that became the Lutheran perspective. The problem with that, of course, is that Paul did not ever imagine any such thing as a worldwide church that would come to control the entire sphere of Europe. This was not a thing that he imagined. Some Christians in the Eastern Mediterranean, actually, during the time of the Reformation, pointed out to Luther and the other reformers that they were misinterpreting Paul. But that didn't really begin to sink in for Western theologians really until like the late 20th century. And I might butcher the names here. Well, at least one of them. There was a scholar by the name of Christer Stendahl and E.P. Sanders began to challenge scholars and theologians to read Paul on Paul's own terms. And this happened like 50 years ago. This was started to happen in the 50s. So the new perspective on Paul has been around since the 70s, maybe even before that. When the phrase "the new perspective" was coined, I think maybe the late 70s or early 80s, but the work had already been done before that. And this movement became known as the new perspective on Paul. Now, I feel that these terms, for an academic setting, they work because academics and scholars kind of know what everybody's talking about. But really, the new perspective is the pre-Lutheran, pre-medieval church perspective. It's the ancient perspective, how Paul viewed things, not how the reformers viewed things, but how Paul, as a first century Jewish follower of Jesus, would have viewed things. So a new perspective could also be called like the ancient or the oldest perspective, but we have the terms we have and we're kind of stuck with those. And another misnomer here is that the new perspective on Paul is univocal, meaning that everyone holds to precisely the exact same ideas and how they understand the writings of Paul the Apostle. And that isn't really true either. There are many variations on the new perspective. E.P. Sanders' understanding, who is sort of the giant in this field. There are many others, but E.P. Sanders' understanding is different from N.T. Wright's understanding. And N.T. Wright is a Anglican bishop. I think he may be retired now. I'm not 100% sure. Is he a bishop or just a priest? I can't remember, but I believe he's a bishop, or he was. Anyway, N.T. Wright, great author, great scholar, but he and E.P. Sanders, even though they're working in the same field, have slightly different perspectives on this. And so things differ between people. The new perspective is really a discussion in biblical scholarship, and the academic consensus is this: that Luther and the other reformers' interpretation of Paul was important for their own day, relevant for their own day, but is not really what the Apostle Paul intended. And of course, this actually, again, makes sense because Luther is dealing with a church that's 1,600 years old, and Paul is dealing with a church that's barely, not even a generation old. So obviously, time is going to add different challenges, and history is going to create new things. So how does all of this help you, or what does this matter to you as a Christian? And if the Lutheran perspective is like not the ancient original perspective, is it not helpful at all, or should we just do away with it? Is it obsolete? And I would say, of course, I'm a Lutheran minister, but I think even other historians, not of the Lutheran worldview, would say no, that Luther had some very important things to say. Now, this video isn't really about the Reformation, so I'm not going to go into all the particularities of the Reformation. But I think what Luther did, and the early reformers, along with Luther, what they did in the Western Europe was pick up and begin to write about a reality that they saw in the history of God's people. And this is where this matters to you, the Christian today. And in the history of God's people, human beings have this tendency to come to a belief, and then they teach it and even preach it, that we are capable of saving ourselves. That if we just follow all of God's laws and rules, or at least most of them, that God will eventually love us, care for us, will earn God's favor, and eventually we'll get to heaven. All Christians around the world, Lutheran, Roman Catholic, Orthodox, would completely disagree with that. And Luther disagreed with it, right? Like, this is the point he's making, is that people are misunderstanding the gospel. And what Luther articulates with his interpretation of the Pauline epistles is that what people tend to believe, that we can save ourselves, that we can just follow all the rules, is not the gospel of Jesus Christ. For Luther, the gospel is a pure gift, unearned, and nothing we can ever do can ever add to anything that Christ has done on the cross. What the work of the new perspective on Paul has done is show us that this discussion about can we earn our way to heaven, can we not earn our way to heaven, is not really a question that Paul is wrestling with. Paul is wrestling with a very different situation when he writes the epistles. He's wrestling with a new way of being Jewish. And then how do we invite Gentiles into that? How are Gentiles accepted? Well, by the time of the Reformation, the church had already figured all of that out, thanks to Paul. But Paul isn't thinking about something that for him wouldn't exist for, another 1,000 years, like a way of thinking. He's not doing that. So what the new perspective on Paul has done is shown us how Paul would have understood what he was writing, as best we can determine anyway. That the Lutheran understanding is a reaction to the misunderstandings and miscommunications and even abuses of the Christian church in Western Europe at the time of the Reformation, 500 years ago. So the new perspective on Paul is informative. It can show us what Paul meant, but it doesn't negate the historic, like Lutheran idea of, hey, only God saves us, because that is universally accepted by all Christians. Again, Roman Catholicism, Orthodox, every version of Christianity, with a few exceptions that are out there, particularly in the United States, that and it does teach that we can save ourselves as long as we do enough good things and follow God's commands. But that's why Paul and the new perspective is so important, because it shows us that Paul would not only necessarily not quite see things the way Luther did, but that Paul would absolutely not see things the way certain groups of Christians in the United States might see things either. So how do I end this? This is, as I said, a very theological, nerdy thing. What I would say is this: the new perspective of Paul is relevant today because we need to know what Paul really meant, because it informs our theology. It informs how we read the scriptures. It informs how we live out our life today. And I don't have time to go into all the ways that the Pauline epistles have been abused and misused over the centuries by the church, including the Lutheran Church. I don't have time to do that. But the new perspective on Paul gets us back to what Paul meant. But it doesn't negate historic Reformation theology. And it to me, it enhances it, because it shows us that Luther and the Reformers are dealing with something very specific, and today we're dealing with something very different. And so Luther may not quite make as much sense to us as it may have made 500 years ago. And I think we use both of these perspectives, the new perspective, the ancient perspective, and kind of say, hey, how do these things get along? How do they agree? And all of these things inform the text and inform our study of it. If you want some more reading on like just how the Lutherans view salvation in particular, and how we actually agree with the Roman Catholic Church, I would point you to the Joint Declaration on the Doctrine of Justification. That's a very important document. And I've gone on enough. I know I'm over the 10 minutes. But I want to thank you for the question. Next week, it will hopefully be a not as nerdy question, but I love doing the nerdy stuff. So thank you for an important question. And yes, the new perspective on Paul is still out there. It hasn't gone away. Yes, it is used. Yes, it is taught in seminary. We were taught it actually in seminary, but we're also taught the Lutheran perspective and how both of those things can enhance our reading and study of the Bible. So I think I'll leave it there. Have a great day, everyone. And until next time, I will see you. Bye, everybody.